Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We're into our last session of the day. It looks to be very interesting. It's, again, a great panel of people to present. And this panel is being moderated by our friend Bob Kapoor. I think most people in the Toronto AML space know Bob quite well by reputation. He's currently an independent AML ATF consultant. He has over 20 years experience. He was the former deputy chief AML officer at one of Canada's big five banks and knows pretty much everything about an AML program, AML, ATF, sanctions, pulled it all together. He's been very involved in the industry groups and public-private committees charged with enhancing Canada's regime. So without further ado, and to give them as much time as possible, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to Canadian Institute for the work done on putting on this event. You know, it's always a pleasure to be part of these conferences. I talk a lot about, if you've ever heard me at a conference or at a presentation, about the need for the financial crime fighting community to gather and share insights to help us collectively fight the good fight. So even though we can't all be in the same place, it's great that we're able to, to do that and share our experiences and insights and, protect the country and our financial community. It was dawning on me, it's been 20 years since Canada put in the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Act and regs, and the evolution that we've all had to go through just because financial crime has evolved so much. And now in particular, right, we have increasing regulatory expectations. Canada has international pressure to improve the regime. From a society standpoint, I think individually, we all want and our organizations want to do better. And even the type of money that's being laundered is evolving, right? With the emergence of virtual currencies and NFTs, Bitcoin. So we're all asked to evolve our program, but we always also have a pressure to do so on a cost-effective basis, right? That's the business reality of the world we're in. So a lot of topics, and I think we've heard a lot already today, and I'm very happy to introduce our panel who's going to talk on some of the methods that the organizations are using to evolve to meet those demands, the challenges, the opportunities, and other considerations that need to be made, including on how to resource the team or the teams that each organization has in this space. So I'll introduce the panel now. I'm very pleased to have my colleagues here. First, Richard Moore. He's the head of the US AML risk, the BSA officer, and the head of second line fraud risk function for Scotiabank in the United States. Prior to that, Richard was in law enforcement, had other roles in fraud and financial crime risk at other institutions. Dr. Ian Messenger has had extensive international law enforcement background. More recently, he's been teaching at various higher learning institutions on the subjects of financial crime. And last year, Ian launched the 12 Financial Crime Education Program, which is a developmental program for new financial crime professionals. And last but not least, Laura Houlihan is the Associate Director of Financial Crimes Advisory with AML RightSource. Laura has over 15 years of AML ATF financial crime compliance experience and has held senior roles at various financial institutions, including as the CAMLO and Chief Compliance Officer. So I want to thank them for being here. Before we start into the meat of the discussion, there is a poll that if you can all go to your the poll section on your the right part of your screen, we can go to the first poll question just to set some context. Does your current team have the skills in place to meet existing and future fin crime needs? So when I talk fin crime, we're looking at AML, ATF, fraud, etc., the whole gamut. So yes, the group has the necessary skill sets, partially, but we need to invest in training for key roles. No, due to the lack of internal expertise, or no, due to the lack of expertise in the market. So if you could take a minute there and click on one of your answers. We'll see what give it a few more seconds. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good that we don't see a lot of no's.
Yes.
And it looks like the majority is, partially, your team partially has the skills in place, need to invest in some training, and almost a third of you say the group has the necessary skill sets in place already. So maybe we'll use that as the launch pad, and talk about some of the existing gaps in the marketplace, and what are organizations looking to how they're looking to fill those positions. So maybe I'll just open up to whoever wants to take that first. Richard, why don't we start with you?
Okay, start with me. I think obviously some of the challenges we have out there, it's a limited talent pool, and organisations are facing the same challenges. They have regulatory pressure, remediation issues that are coming online as that regulator takes more focus, and as they go out to get the resourcing, whether it's permanent resourcing, contract resourcing, the talent pool's shallow, and we've got to think about different ways in which we can get the people that we need to address the challenges that we have. And a great exponent is that there's plenty of people out there doing different things. They may not be AML or fraud people, but they're doing things like analytics, whether it's in market risk or marketing itself, credit risk, and repurposing those folk to support on the analytics side. On the fraud or AML side. So I think the pool's there. They just may not be traditional AML and fraud exponents that we need to grab hold of. And so the other point is the focus of what we do in AML and fraud now is a little bit different than 5 years or 10 years ago. And the type of person, the personality that we need now is a little bit different. We're really risk managers. We're moving away from just that compliance focus and doing what the regulation says, to managing the risk in the organisation, much more business partnership, being part of the strategy and building controls and processes to enable business to do things safely. So I think really changing the focus of the individuals that we have and bringing the organisations a key challenge and opportunity for us at the same time. But I think limited talent pool, a lot of pressure across the banks, and people are trying to grab the same resources.
I think a key point I took from Richard there was to be flexible and to be adaptable. I think I've noticed in conversations with those working in private sector, as it links into my students, for example, I'm hearing a lot of those who are in the hiring space moving away from those kind of rigid requirements of having ACAM certifications or having all the letters under the sun after your name, and now having an appreciation of those transferable skills. I think that's a key thing, as Richard mentioned, as there are new skill sets which are needed in this space, and other sectors do have them. It's a shame if we pass on the perfect candidate or a good candidate just because they maybe don't have 4 letters after their name, for example. And I see this especially in the next generation of financial crime professionals, those who are in higher education, in college and university. They're coming up to graduating with, in some cases, degrees in intelligence analysis, like the one I teach at Seneca. And it's been very hard to get work experience, especially in the environment we're in right now with COVID. There's limited internships and co-ops. So it's very hard for these up-and-comers to showcase their best selves in their resumes because they don't have the fin crime experience, but they may have experience from other sectors which have those transferable soft skills.
Yes, and agreed with both of you gentlemen. It's very important these days to not only deal with AML and financial crime experts in your AML program. You need to look outside the box a little bit and leverage from different areas, as Dr. Messenger said, around, statistical analytics and those types of things that can really, once you have these things in place, like such as model validations and all that fun stuff to ensure that your models are tuned properly and efficiently so that you have the best use of your resources. So I totally am in agreement with the leveraging resources from different areas of expertise, not just focusing on AML compliance with those 4 letters after your name, as Dr. Messenger said.
So for senior people and people who've been in, AML for a long time, how does one avoid becoming an anachronism, right? How would you suggest a senior person, number one, who doesn't necessarily tick all the boxes, but has great depth and experience in the traditional AML compliance, even to some extent risk management roles? How would you suggest they fill those gaps for themselves? And what are organizations looking for when you try to fill senior levels, particularly when you have to demonstrate to regulators that, yeah, your CAMLO, your chief risk officer do have that expertise? Why don't we start? I'm Ian. You're in oh, sorry. Go ahead, Laura.
So I was just going to say it's very important because we all know that the CAMLO or the chief compliance officer, the compliance officer, whatever you may call them at your firm, needs to have the resources in place to ensure they execute on their mandate. And that is sometimes a challenge, right? But as Peter Work said earlier in one of our presentations, challenges, they bring opportunities. And I think Richard even said it already as well. So I think that's something that we need to think about as well with the challenges in resourcing at this time, especially during COVID, and also thinking of the opportunities it may bring for those who don't fit inside that box, and tick all the boxes. There's room, I believe, to be more open and kind of have a holistic view of the potential candidates that you're looking for to staff your team.
That's a great which Laura makes, and it really feeds into something. When I think about this question, I think about 2 particular approaches. Firstly is the almost self-inflicted problem which the industry has caused for itself, because in many cases, and I think we'll touch upon this later in this session, is there's quite a short-term view sometimes when it comes to hiring the junior and middle level staff at investigator, analyst, team lead even level. So if we're looking to equip future senior leaders, we need to have consistency and longevity in role, which makes it very difficult for those director levels, those CAMLOs, to source their senior managers, for example, if there's no kind of internal talent pool that is consistent. If all the junior staff are on 6 months or 9 month or 12-month contracts, it's a revolving door. But I think as a way to mitigate that, Laura mentioned about being more open and flexible about who you're hiring, and I think that's something that really is key, because we know in our profession that it's constantly changing. So we know the opposition are constantly changing, the regulations are constantly changing, the way money launderers launder money is constantly changing. So we need to have staff who are adaptable. And if you have a candidate who can think on their feet, has a demonstrated track record, going back to Richard's earlier point, maybe from a different sector, if there's something that can be transferred to our industry, I think if you have a hiring manager or a CAMLO who's thinking long term, who has a candidate in mind that maybe it's just a knowledge piece which needs to be upskilled, then it's worth exploring that, I think.
Just to add to that, Ian, really, I think it's very important that if you do explore those opportunities and that your candidate that you do bring on maybe doesn't have or has a lack of, the foundational AML knowledge, that the firm provides them the expertise that they need, the training they need, like just maybe an internal course or some type of training, just so that they ensure that such talent that may be outside the box is properly trained at the same time. But they don't need to be experts, as we said, excuse me, in AML and financial crime these days. They as we said, you can pull these experts from many different realms.
Yeah, no, just to add to that, I think, particularly at the higher levels of leadership, those qualities are adaptable across silos. So you could take somebody from, whether it's operational risk, credit risk, even the business, and bring them into a leadership role. And the qualities of organizational design, people management, stakeholder and board management, they're adaptable. But there needs to also be recognition that you still need that support structure of capability and expertise to inform those senior people. But so I might be costing myself a job, but you don't necessarily have to come through law enforcement and compliance and AML to be able to lead the organisation in that space. But there's pros and cons. But certainly when the talent pool is limited, that flexibility and adaptability needs to be present.
Sure. So, in terms of assessing those gaps, Richard, what would you say, is the right, what would be the approach to do that? What's sort of the frequency, in terms of identifying that and trying to fill those?
Yeah, I think succession planning is a big part, and I'm not a HR person, but planning for the future, having that 2, 3, 4 year plan, because people leave organisations, people move roles. But having the plan and building that succession now and say, what am I going to need in 2 to 3 years? Who in the organisation? It may not be your direct organisation. We've just gone through a process where there's people from the first line that may be the next successor in the second line AML role, etc. So opening up the pool, recognising it, starting to build that pipeline now. And if that means additional training or even just bringing them into the tent and creating awareness of what the program is and what they're executing and what the roadmap is to get that knowledge base growing, I think that's a key. Not just waiting until it happens and all of a sudden having to fill important roles and not having that pipeline of multiple options. Because, again, if you pin your hopes on one person and they leave, you've got the same issue. But having that 2 or 3 people or more in the roadmap that you're developing along the way, extremely important.
Just a reminder to everyone who's out there, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Certainly would love to hear what you have to say, and the panel will be happy to answer the questions. We talk about the gaps, and one of the alternatives to in-house promotions or moving people in-house is outsourcing. So maybe Laura, get your thoughts on what do you think about outsourcing for a financial crime model? Where can it be useful? Where do you think it does have opportunities and challenges?
Well, I'm a bit biased, I will say, being in the role I'm in. However, even when I was with the big banks and the payment companies in the past, I believe outsourcing, it can really assist companies when they're in a crunch and they have certain, say, issues they need to deal with in a very timely manner, such as, say, we have COVID, right? A whole whackload of firms alert went haywire, I'm sure, during that period. It wasn't just the ones I was around. So I think in those cases where you have an overload of alerts, you cannot manage these things. You can't do it in time. You have your watch list going crazy and false positives left and right. Those are things you can easily outsource to a group of analysts at a firm that can easily provide you those managed services, and they're already trained as AML advisors and analysts. Most of them all have their CAMs. Pretty much everyone does at the firm I'm at. So, and you really, it's easily, you can get these up and running very fast. So you can, have a chat one day, sign your contract the next day, and then get your API hooked up to the contractor and have your analysts start working on it. And I know it's not as easy as that, but there are definite pluses for that. And definitely with respect, as I said, to COVID, how there's so many, we're working remotely. So with outsourcing, they're working remotely as well already. So say you have someone who is ill or can't come to the office or can't perform their duties at this time, and you need to fill something very quick, and you don't want to spend the time, or you don't have the funding, the budget to hire someone full time at this moment if they're coming back, for example. You could easily outsource a role such as that to help ensure your team meets its compliance requirements.
An interesting question just came in from one of the audience members. Have you seen examples instead of pure outsourcing, it's done on internal secondment type of situation where someone from the front line moves to the second line on a part-time basis and then goes back? Have you seen good examples of that being used?
Yes, there's definitely, and that touches on our earlier points, I think, too, as well as leveraging the expertise from other lines of business or other areas and realms of expertise. So yes, definitely, that's a great thing you can do within your firm as well, if you're able to. You can easily take, for example, I don't know, an analyst, and kind of, I don't want to say repurpose, but you can definitely do something and say, hey, we need you to do XYZ now. And it's totally different from what they do now. So they were, for example, doing financial analysis. They could now be doing forensic and fraud type of analysis, and have those types of, leveraging scenarios from each different departments, definitely.
You want to add something?
Yeah, no, I just want to add, and I think that was part of the discussion before that pipeline. So the pipeline can be people in the first line, those expressions of interest who'd like to, develop the knowledge of that second line function, and you start to learn what's available in the organisation to bring them through as well. So the talent pool around the organisation. So I think it's important. I know we ran, I don't want to call it a secondment program, but certainly a development program where people would come and spend a month, and sometimes they would stay a little bit longer depending on what the engagement was, but getting that mix. And sometimes they didn't come back on a full-time basis, but as they went back to the first line, they certainly had more of an understanding of their responsibilities and what the second line did in the organisation. But I just wanted to build on the outsourcing. I think it makes sense, in different situations. bigger organisations outsourcing, centrally, hubs or something, doing common, KYC or alert management, etc. I think that makes sense. And then you go to the other side where the smaller organisations might use a utility type service to share the cost across different organisations. I think that makes sense. But I think we've got to be cautious on is that we're not outsourcing accountability. It's the execution responsibility, but you remain accountable, and you still have to have the infrastructure and the oversight of that outsourcing service to make sure that they're doing what you expect and what the regulator expects. And it was only recently, I think there was a penalty in the US for a bank that outsourced to an internal utility and didn't have the necessary oversight. So I think it's an option. It makes sense in different scenarios, but still that accountability remains with you as the organisation.
I'd like to add to that. I think it's as part of the 12 program, we've always approached our profession in context. So we say that context is key, and I think there's no better way of adding context to an investigation unit than bringing in staff who have that direct customer-facing experience. And I think if I go back to our first discussion about skills gaps and talent gaps, and we think about how most investigation functions and teams work, it's an individual who has a laptop and several monitors, especially in the COVID space, and they're making decisions maybe to file an STR or demarket or to close without any action based on documents, based on Excel spreadsheets, internal systems. Whereas we know, especially here in Canada, we are a very international, multicultural country, and we have a client base which is ultimately as diverse. So we need to really leverage that customer-facing experience. And I know from my experience on the 12 program and from my students' own experiences at Seneca and at other institutions, there are many individuals who start their compliance careers in frontlines, and they have that face-to-face experience with a customer, and they can translate a customer's activity or transactions and put it into context and put some explanation. And that's definitely, I would say it's a two-way exchange, because on the one hand, it gives those frontline staff some great next opportunities, next steps if they want to further the compliance profession, but also it gives some context and some real world experience to those who work in the second line, because I think it's very easy, especially if you manage to find an organization that has a very stable investigation unit. It may be months or years since they've actually had face-to-face contact with a customer, and they're making their decisions based on text on a screen rather than those non-verbal cues that are so important.
I think that's so interesting, Ian, what you said. It actually takes me back over 20 years when I started as a teller at Bank of Montreal, and worked my way up, did the face-to-face, I'm opening accounts for people and everything like that. And then after my schooling, there's some feedback there. After my schooling, I joined it was a pre-audit team. So they actually leveraged resources from the lines of business and seconded them to this team that was like the pre-audit team before, I don't know, OSFI was coming in or some regulator. Let's say this is in, I don't know, early 2000s, mid 2000s. So, and that's really what got me into compliance, and I found, I guess, my passion for AML and financial crime and helping people get it right the first time through coaching and just sharing your knowledge with others, and it was great. So I just wanted to mention that because I couldn't help it.
Sure. And, Ian, what you said before about, the context from the front lines. I know when I was with the bank, a lot of the hires we did for the investigations team were frontline people because, they had the context. They knew what a typical customer activity looked like, what behavior would look like. And, the unusual transaction reports in terms of referrals were often more successful at finding reportable suspicious transactions, reportable suspicious activity than the system. Certainly early on in the adoption of our monitoring system.
Exactly.
So, and maybe we can talk about that. And sorry, Richard, I just want to maybe move over to the discussion about technology and how technology can, enhance a program. Where can you get the most bang for the buck? And what do you think that the impacts of increased technology is in terms of resourcing needs?
That's a great question, and I recently on one of my programs had a presenter come in from Quantexa, the fintech company, and seeing a live demonstration of some of the mapping tools and the data leveraging tools. I remember when I was starting out in law enforcement, we had a pen and paper and maybe I2 as a way of stitching together information. Now we have these technological solutions that bring everything together on the one screen. Obviously, going back to my earlier comment about context is key, I don't think technology will replace many of the level 3 type investigation rules, because I think at the end of the day, we still need that human context, that human judgment to make a decision based on reasonableness, based on the client's circumstance. But I think there's some great technological solutions that can help us get to that decision making point much quicker and much more efficient, and that will obviously that will allow resources to be freed up in other parts of the business.
Yeah, I just want to add on that, Bob. I think there's some great technology out there. The contextual monitoring is definitely the way we need to head, and simple little things like you get a transaction alert and you don't know why, and you've got to trace that back and understand actually it was a loan we curated and that payment's going out to that client because of that loan. So we've done all this due diligence and then we create an alert to look at. But if you had the context feeding through your detection systems and said, it's okay, it's a loan, we've done the due diligence, it's fine, and just created or got rid of that noise. I think the biggest challenge we have is, and continues to be, is data. The tools that are out there are fantastic, but they're data intensive, and the level or the granularity or the availability of data, some of the banks or a lot of the banks struggle with. We're operating legacy systems that weren't designed for fraud or AML. They were designed to have general ledger roll-ups for monthly statements. And I think that's the challenge we have, is working together to get the right data solution to feed these new technologies. And part of that is coming together and making those investments for multiple purposes, whether it's credit, whether it's AML, whether it's fraud, and using them in the way that supports the needs. But certainly great technology, but data remains the key challenge for the banks.
Yeah, I was just going to add there. I think it's really important that you have a good plan in implementing and managing these automated systems. There's, as Richard said, there's a gazillion of them out there now that want to help us be more efficient and can do these great complex lovely charts for us and make things more illustrative than they were before in, I guess, our previous days in the financial world. However, it's very important that you have your models validated and make sure that they're picking up the correct things that they should be picking up. And to Richard's point, you know, learning from client activity. So for example, in COVID, people use cash more. Post-COVID, people are using electronic transactions more and more every single day, right? I don't know how many of you have gotten cash out recently. I haven't had a need to, so everything is plastic, and that's something that needs to be considered when you have such systems in place to ensure that they're constantly changing, and that if it has an AI function, then that's great. You just have to make sure that that model that it's using is validated and that it's catching the right things it should be.
Great. And I want to move on to our next topic because I think that the discussion on technology is certainly relevant to that. So why don't we go up to our next poll question? If I can get you to put that up. And if everyone wants to go to their the poll tab in their column on the right, we're talking about now the convergence of AML with other financial crime groups. So is your organization pursuing that? The options, we're not considering combining them at this time, exploring it, but no time frame is set. We're considering it within the next 1 to 3 years, or we've already combined groups. So if you can maybe take a look at that and answer the poll question, see the status of the room. Wow, it's a pretty mixed bag. Right across the spectrum. So take that into consideration. I mean, we're seeing that in certain institutions, you know, the Framel groups or fusion groups. So maybe you can talk about some of the benefits of that, and some of, you know, where do you think that it fits well? Where do you think it works better? And some of the challenges in transitioning to that model. Maybe start with, and Richard, I think you have experience in that sort of world at Scotiabank, so maybe you can talk about it first, and then we'll hear from you.
Yeah, probably we've combined AML and sanctions, and we're bringing fraud, at least from the second line perspective. So we're sort of starting the journey and determining what that looks like. So no set agenda. But the two previous organisations I was at, we did combine, you know, financial crime, so fraud, AML, sanctions, investigations, analytics, under the one umbrella. In the second organisation, we had cybersecurity as well. What I saw as opportunity, obviously the tools that we use, we had common case management, common analytical tools that we used. Detection engines were, you know, depending on the need, and, you know, that in-time detection, obviously fraud's a lot quicker. You want to stop before you lose. AML post-transactions generally okay. But then we saw, and we're seeing it in Canada too, but where, you know, wire type fraud, you know, where it's actually AML activity, but it was hitting accounts, and we wanted to put delays. So using the same sort of tools that we would do in a credit card fraud to start to stop a wire transaction, to give it time to clear. So adapting the fraud methodology to some of the AML activity. But going back to the people, particularly at the first organisation, it was creating a career path. And, you know, we could bring people in at the analyst level and do, you know, 24/7 fraud detection and credit cards. They sort of progress into online banking fraud and origination fraud. When they got that skill set, we could bring them into the AML team, more, you know, more investigative type work, or even into the internal fraud team. So they had some direction where they could take their career. And a lot of them actually moved out of that into the first line controls. They built that knowledge up of, you know, second line capability, and took it into the first line controls as we sort of developed that approach as well. So the tools, the technology platforms, better use of common resourcing, but also a bit of a career development opportunity through the various stages of the business.
Yeah, that's a good point, Richard, you make there, with integrating the groups together and the challenges that we face. I do recall from my days at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, when I joined there, they had just recently combined their teams, and that was 2010. It was called the Global Financial Crimes Compliance Team. So I was VP of the Global Financial Crimes Compliance Team of Bank of America in Canada here, Canada branch. And so they had a pretty early start in, ensuring the financial crimes were all housed in one area. Obviously, coming from the siloed sort of, perspective or outlook or departmental kind of, silos that there are evident in the past models. Consolidating them was challenging, but in the end, you end up getting and reaching further efficiencies within the group. And that was definitely evident within the group, because we were able to leverage from different mindsets, different areas, So I was looking at an alert, and it looked like a big forensic fraud Ponzi scheme. So then we sent off to the fraud, forensic department within the Global Financial Crimes team, right? So you have your little different sub departments within the whole team. So.
And that's a great example for really why convergence is beneficial, because when we talk about efficiencies, we should also think about those missed opportunities as well, especially in the regulatory context. In that example which Laura gave about a fraud being identified, if for example we were working in a siloed approach and that particular issue wasn't picked up by anti-money laundering, for example, it may not have made its way into an STR. Or more broadly, if we look at those financial crime types which are all encompassing above AML, those crime types which transcend, I'm thinking of sanctions, evasion, the cases of bribery and corruption, where context is key. So having that holistic knowledge, whether it's the individual themselves being more of a generalist and having a larger skill set, or a combined unit being able to leverage from different internal teams, I think can only serve as a benefit. Especially speaking to those in industry and speaking to those that work in the fraud space, there's a big question mark here in Canada right now about FINTRAC's approach to fraud, and whether it's indeed something which they're interested in, whether it's reportable. And having spoken to many individuals from many different banks, it's a bit of a crapshoot, frankly, which banks file and don't file. But if we look at that perspective, we think about, well, if your AML investigators or analysts don't have a fraud mindset of fraud awareness, how many opportunities could be missed? So definitely it's not just a cost saving exercise. I think it's a harmonizing of skill sets.
So Richard, maybe if you wanted to add something, please, but then I'll go into a question.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that's where the tools come in, the ability, common case management infrastructure. You talked earlier about contextual, starting to say, well, okay, this might not be a fraud, but it doesn't look right. We need to do a little bit more work on it, and it could be something else. And I agree, at the moment, some of the siloed approaches are that we're probably missing stuff. We're stopping that fraud, but we're not thinking about what the fraud was about and taking that next level. You've got internal referral process, they're manual, they take time. people may not be thinking contextually because they've got to get to the next alert. So giving the right tools and information sharing capability through technology, definitely required.
So, when we talk about the different types of financial crime, right? So fraud, when you're investigating fraud, often it's with the objective for cost recovery or fraud prevention. Whereas AML it's after the fact, it's detection. Sanctions, it's, very much prescribed black and white requirements versus AML, which is more principles based. So how do you effectively train a group? If you've combined a group, can you effectively train them to do, masters of all trades? Or is that even possible? Or should that be the objective?
I think it goes back to the poll question. One of the big issues that came up was resourcing and budget. And I think that's, you don't need to have individuals who are experts in every field. I mean, but if those individuals existed, they would certainly be moving up the career path very quickly. But I think, and this is the approach we take in the 12 program, is by focusing on a hierarchy of financial crimes. So I think fraud and AML do go very, very well together. That's why FRAML is such an acronym. But if we think about fraud, fraud being that predicate offense, but then we always have a money laundering piece afterwards, don't we? When the proceeds of that fraud is then moved on. So having a strong fraud awareness, I would say, is key, and it's perfect. I think it's very easily, very cost effectively achievable. I hear people say, oh, we need to send people on the CFE certification, for example. No, we don't. In my experience, I have advised all my students that there's a Coursera course called Fraud Investigation and Forensic Accounting, and that's a free course, and that gives a great perspective into the mindset of fraudsters, and it gives investigators, it gives students a different perspective when it comes to fraud. I think when we look at anti-bribery and corruption, we look at sanctions, which are typically more policy and procedure based. As you say, they're very black and white, but having a working knowledge about what they are might help those AML investigators to put pieces together. And one of the advices I give to my students is to think about how potential cases of sanctions and bribery and corruption could manifest themselves during the course of an investigation. And that's really your external research piece.
Sure. Laura, I want to put this question to you. It's an audience question. And just because you've seen various sizes of organizations, this person's asked, we have a very small team. We have a risk manager, compliance manager, and a chief compliance and risk officer. So what are other key roles we should consider for our team to be successful? And maybe talk about it in an organization where they, both the fusion model and in an organization that's more traditional, that has the separate pillars. Then we'll move on to our next final topic.
In the Q&A there, sorry. I just wanted to, yeah, to make sure there. Okay. Yes. So definitely you do see these still today, and even 20 years ago, you see the, secondments once in a while firms will utilize to leverage their, they have some key people in their organization who they think can assist with the second line. They've been in the first line already, or they're going to do great in the second line and help to basically proactively catch any issues that there could be in the first line, right? And really, I think whatever line you're in, really, the key thing is we're all in it together. It's, I want to think, I like to think about it like that. Like whether you're in the first, second, or third line, everybody in the organization has that accountability to ensure they act in compliance with the firm's compliance requirements, right? And lawful regulations. And they should be trained to do so. And that should be particular to your job. So if you're moving from first line to second line, it's definitely a given that you will probably need some more training, and that the firm should definitely be offering to provide that if it's not there already, if it hasn't been. So if that would be definitely something I would ask if I had an opportunity such as that, which I have in the past. So that's what I would do. But definitely great opportunities can come out of these types of things where you're exposed to a different line, basically, within the 3 lines of defense model.
Sure. So it's a matter of having, roles, senior, like you said, accountability at senior levels in all areas.
Yeah, really. Yeah, everybody has accountability in the organization, and we're all in it together.
I want to move to the next poll question. We have about 5 to 7 minutes, so we can go to the last poll question for everyone. It'll be coming up right here. So COVID-19 obviously is in the undercurrent of everything we're doing these days. So how's your organization dealing with the resource issues resulting from the pandemic? So no issues. We had a good BCP program in place. Some issues initially, but smooth sailing now. Significant impact on productivity as a result of remote work, or it's been a disaster. I've heard talking with people in the on the street various answers. So it's why don't we see what the audience says. Well, that's good news. No one's considering a disaster. Most people are saying no issues or some issues initially and smooth sailing now, which I suppose in a year later is not unexpected necessarily, but pleasantly a pleasant surprise. I want to talk about this because we talked about outsourcing earlier on, and this came up in a audience question. Is it easier or harder to outsource? And how hard is it to teach a contractor your systems? And I would extend that to, your processes and your culture as well. Maybe we'll start with Richard on that one.
I'll be quite honest, my turnover in the last 13 or 14 months has been really low. We brought on 1 or 2 full-time replacements where we had to have a remote setup and some training. But generally we've been pretty well served in that space, but other parts of the business have had a little bit more turnover, and they're actually, they bring resources in. So they'll do a rotation of 6 weeks and actually train the contractors on site for that period of time. So there's different approaches depending on the business that we're involved in. So my KYC team are the ones that will come in for a 6-week sort of period, coach the new staff, make sure that they understand the systems and processes, and then that person could then work remotely post the 6 weeks. So different approaches, but fortunately in the second line, I've probably got the other challenge is we haven't got the turnover we might need, but
maybe we'll start with you, Richard, just spend a minute or so talking about the general considerations on the post-COVID world, because I think we're nearing that world. What do you think some of the, how has COVID affected the future of FinCrime functions? Do you think there'll be permanent changes as a result in terms of prioritization of staffing, of resourcing, or just the focus of the group in general? Whoever wants to start it.
Well, definitely we all know that there's been enormous changes post-COVID with any work stream and all firms. So it's not just the banking world or the financial world. This has affected everyone. And really, I just think with the prevalence of fraud, with, given the COVID pandemic, there's been the prevalence of fraud, and that's something we all need to still be focused on, is that the fraudsters and, the bad guys or gals are going to, continue to change the way that they carry out their fraudulent activities to try and, get around those great models we've built and the AI and that type of thing. So it's always important to make sure that you stay up with your validations, as I said before, and ensure your systems are tuned properly and that you're catching the right things you need to catch. Be proactive.
And I think also it's a great opportunity to change our ways of working and our ways of thinking as well. I mean, we've been through this for what, a year and a half now, people working from home, really pushing the trust and accountability piece in your staff. And I think what I've started to see, and I've had a couple of students in the past month who've been able to take employment opportunities outside of their commuting distance. As companies are starting to think about post-COVID, and do we have to go back to a physical office? Can we now work remotely? Can we also hire staff from outside of our area? I've had a number of students who've recently gained posts in small upstarts in Alberta, and they live in Toronto. Or if they can manage that time difference, they live in Vancouver and they can apply for jobs in Toronto. I think if you have your policies and processes in place where you don't have that productivity impact, it's a great opportunity for employers to, maybe take some steps in addressing those talent gaps that they think they might have, or those knowledge gaps, purely based on the local employment market.
Perfect. And I think that's a great dovetail back to our original commentary, and so appreciate that. I know that we have just a minute left, so I just want to say thanks to everyone on the panel, Laura, Ian, Richard. Thanks for your time and your insights today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks a lot to, again, Bob, Ian, Richard, Laura. That was a great discussion, and things that we need to start considering more as we are growing in the COVID space and moving into our post-COVID times. So really interesting discussion. I think, I'm not sure if Michael is popping in now as well for our kind of closing remarks, but I really hope that everyone had a wonderful day one and was able to get a lot from all of the speakers. I know that I have a number of points that I've written down to take away to really pull a couple ideas together into our AML program at my organization. And so I'm really looking forward to day two and what we can learn tomorrow morning. Michael, final thoughts?
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, it was a marathon day. Lots of information. I think that the speakers made fantastic use of their time slots, and we went pretty much right up until the moment on all the presentations. So I think that people definitely got what they came for. Tomorrow, I'm expecting it to be just as good. We have a couple of fantastic speakers lined up. I know that we have a panel that's going to be speaking on Indigenous banking tomorrow, which is going to be an interesting topic that I haven't heard about very frequently in any conference circles. And then Sam Cooper is going to be presenting tomorrow as well. Him and I will be doing a fireside chat. So tune in for that. Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time, sticking it out till the end of the day. I know that you know, it's late, but we really appreciate you guys sticking around for all the presentations, and hope to see you back here tomorrow.
And I believe we start bright and early at 9:50 tomorrow morning, so everyone has
Yes,
a chance to
I'm sorry,
their email and everything, but
um,
before we jump in.
Yes, thanks, Karen. All right. Thanks, guys. Take care and enjoy the